Haiti Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I am your host, Liam Carballal. On today's episode of History Repeats on hmTV, our returning guest is Richard Quinlan. We will be continuing our conversation on Rafael Trujillo, the Parsley Massacre, and the Sosúa settlement.
Thanks for having me back, Liam. Usually I'm not invited back to things, so I really appreciate your kindness.
Yeah, well, you were a great guest last time, so let's keep. Hope we get the same energy. I want to start with a quote here from Rafael. Last time we talked, Rafael Trujillo, a white supremacist and genocidal dictator, just agreed to be the only person at the Évian Conference to accept in Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. Here we have a quote. Efforts to intensify cultivation of our lands are realized, and at the same time, indirectly, there is a favorable change towards ameliorating our ethnic problem, since these immigrant currents bring capable and desirable racial elements to our soil. That is him describing Jews emigrating to his country to negate the Haitian population.
That's a heck of a way to open up a show. There is a lot to that quote. I just want to begin by saying, I know in part one, you and I were talking about Évian, and one of the many unfortunate outgrowths of it is the fact that there were countries that actually tightened immigration policies. I mistakenly said it was Peru and Argentina. It should have been Brazil and Argentina. So I apologize to our good friends and anyone listening from Peru. I wanted to make sure that I was clear on that. That was not on you. That's solely on me. But you listen to his language in that quote, and it really does smack of a lot of Nazi-era language. You know, that idea of soil, and even the concept of a racial question. Right? He's really framing it in a way that's so similar to what we heard coming out of the mouth of Hitler and Goebbels and other top Nazi leaders.
We talk about Nazi leaders, but I mean, anti-Semitism was not something unique to Nazi Germany. I had mentioned that Romper poll at one point. Something like a third of Americans believe that American Jewish citizens should have their rights restricted and their financial powers restricted. Hell of a time to live.
It's very true. I mean, you think about an individual like, say, Father Coughlin, Charles Coughlin, who had millions of listeners on the radio, and he became just increasingly virulent in his anti-Semitism as his career progressed. And he wasn't this lone voice just screaming into the woods. He had tremendous impact, and people listened to his syndicated show. And so you're absolutely right. Anti-Semitism, certainly there's a centuries-long history of it in Europe, but anti-Semitism in America was very much a mainstream style of thinking, which is what makes someone like Eleanor Roosevelt so different, particularly coming from an upper class the way she did, where that was very common to have anti-Semitic feelings. We know through her writings, through her speeches, through her work, Eleanor Roosevelt was not in any way anti-Semitic, and she had obviously a tremendous impact upon her husband's administration. So we are lucky to know she was there to maybe counterbalance so many of the other politicians and administrative members that were speaking to Roosevelt.
The political infighting there, it really it becomes a theme throughout the entire saga of this colony. The Sosúa colony, even though Évian was called by the Roosevelt administration, it was a privately funded venture. The U.S., they volunteered some soil scientists, also some eugenic scientists, which, my God, the 1930s were terrible. But it was mostly paid for by the JDC, the American Jewish Distribution Committee, which was a private charity venture. So the U.S. government, their main appeal to this was the taxpayers weren't going to be bothered. So, yeah, it is incredibly frustrating just how much politics feeds into this sort of thing.
No, it's so true. And the Great Depression, obviously, is the backdrop to all of this that drove so many of those political decisions, the economic crises and fears that Americans had, and the idea of bringing in more competition for jobs, and what did that mean? You know, that it was a time of such uncertainty. I mean, we had Americans leaving to go to the Soviet Union. I mean, the Great Depression is the only time, other than the Civil War, where more Americans left the country than entered it. We had a parade in 1935 in New York City, 38,000 people showing up in support of communism, holding up signs that actually said "Our leader Stalin." I mean, this, you can't. I mean, obviously we can imagine there's certainly radical political thinking now, but to go back into the 1930s and have Roosevelt in office, yet have thousands of people holding up placards of Stalin and thinking that was a better avenue.
Well, it's funny you mention the communists, Rich. So the idea of bringing Jews in to whiten the Dominican Republic, that is as insane an idea as it was not the first time he did that, and arguably the first time he did that was even stranger. So at this time, the Spanish Civil War is going on. The Republican side is losing. Trujillo, being a fascist, he's actually very good friends with Francisco Franco. He actually invites refugees from the Republican side to go emigrate to his country. It's strange, considering the Republican side are mostly anarchists, socialists, and communists. When asked about why he was inviting communists to go settle in his country, because they were white. Yeah.
Again, what is so shocking about all of this is, and it really does encapsulate so much of what was happening in the 30s and well through the Holocaust as well. This was not being done in the shadows. No. They were all saying the quiet parts out loud all the time.
Yeah.
And so you just wonder why there wasn't a greater response to what was being said. I mean, I know obviously there were significant global issues, of course, at that time, but if that, I wonder if you can, I'm sure you can explain, did that help sort of give Trujillo a sense of cover to do what he was doing?
I think the fear of communism in the minds of many people in the West and the free world in the United States outweighed the fear of Nazism. We had already gone through the Civil War. We had seen bloodshed. We hadn't gone through the Holocaust yet. So I think it was what I mentioned in the last episode, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Communism is bad. Hitler hates communism. Maybe Hitler's good. Not good, but better? I don't know.
No, I mean, well, certainly you had Charles Lindbergh out there in the America First movement. Lindbergh had visited Germany, had been awarded, and of course he was back in America giving speeches and say, look at what this guy's doing over there. Look at their unemployment rate. Look at the jobs. And it was very much an acknowledgement by some in America of, well, maybe there is a different way. Maybe capitalism has run its course. Maybe democracy has some serious flaws. If I am unable to feed my family and I'm living in a Hooverville and FDR hasn't been able to get me a job, I mean, when people are frightened, it's frightening where they'll look for answers.
What did Churchill say? Democracy is the worst government in the world, except for all the other ones that have been tried. All right. So Trujillo got the green light from the U.S. Secretary of State, which was good because at the time Trujillo was also trying to negotiate the return of customs duties. When the U.S. withdrew in 1924, the U.S. was still in control of the customs income from the Dominican Republic. That also may have been why he stopped the pogroms as quickly as he did, because he wanted the U.S. friendly so he could get this money that he was so desperate for. The agreement was signed on January 1940 with DORSA, which is the Democratic Republic Settlement Association. That was run by the JDC. That was the settlement for bringing in these Jewish refugees. January 1940 is after the war started. And so that leads me to a question for you. In an ideal world, anti-Semitism is not a thing. Anti-Semitism is not a thing. Political infighting is not a thing. Would Évian even have worked, though? Because Trujillo seemed like he was totally on board bringing refugees in, but he couldn't. He wanted to bring in 100,000 Jewish refugees into the Dominican Republic. They got maybe 1,000, because by then France was being invaded, and you can't get out of Europe. Even if Hitler wanted to let him out, half the countries around him were being bombed.
No, you're absolutely right. And so Évian most likely would not have worked, even without anti-Semitism. You're talking about a war-torn Europe now that is completely enveloped in this horrific blitzkrieg attacks by Germany. So no, overwhelmingly, it still would have been next to impossible to get refugees out safely. And we saw a similar repeat of Évian in Bermuda. On a smaller scale, it was just British and American leaders meeting in Bermuda in 1943, but it was very much the same conversations of it's terrible what's happening to Jewish refugees.
Terrible,
but what can we really do about it? Yeah. So no, you raise an excellent point, and I think what's happened about Évian is that the Dominican Republic sometimes. This is why history is so fascinating, because the Dominican can be held up on a certain level of saying, well, they did something.
Yeah.
And you're talking about this small island nation, whereas the U.S. and England, Australia, these other powerful nations did nothing. But then one quick look beneath the surface and you see the justifications that Trujillo had for his actions, and it completely changes the dynamic of our conversation about this.
Yeah.
But you're right.
So Sosa, I don't want to call it a failure because, again, hundreds of lives were saved. But it could have been better. Sosa, the point of it was to make it an agricultural colony. That also didn't really work. The soil there was not great. And even when there was the beef and dairy industry, which did kind of work at that point. The second the war ended and they were starting to turn a profit, they immediately sold their assets. So while there is a small community in Sosa today, it is mostly a tourist attraction.
Which is in and of itself fascinating. When you think about the origin, and now today the DR is trying to bring people in, and there's golf resorts. I guess if we really want to put a very positive spin on all of this, I guess
it's
you
hard
can
to do.
say, which is impossible to do. But the world's a dark enough place. Maybe you and I can bring a little bit of joy. At least you could say that there is a sense of hope for countries that over the course of decades, over close to a century, perhaps you can evolve. Certainly the DR continues to have serious issues. There's no doubt about it. But can we possibly maybe hold it up and say that there are some good things to take from it? I mean, I'm asking you, this is truly an area where you excel. So, or am I just being the most Pollyannish human being to ever walk the planet here?
The problem is I have the benefit of reading the second half of Trujillo's administration. He is in power for 32 years. Right. 20 of those years are after all this happened, after the massacre. And it's out there. He does not get better. He doesn't commit another genocide on that scale. He tries to create another settlement with Japanese immigrants. you're looking for sense where there isn't one, but he.
Now, what about the attention he received from America when we start talking about post-war and Trujillo's reign at the conclusion of World War II? Does America kind of turn her eyes away from the DR, or do we stay heavily involved and invested?
They turn away for a time. In 1942, after this had all been concluded, I assume Trujillo had done most of this to warm up to the U.S. so he could get those customs returned. He does in 1942. To show you where he stood on this, he had actually been forced to kind of he doesn't take a back seat. He pretends to stop being president. He appoints a puppet to try and pretend like, oh, I'm backing away from this, to try and weasel his way back into the U.S. good graces. The second this treaty, he gets the customs duties back, he immediately takes his old job back. He also, by the 1940s, he starts cracking down on the communists in his country, and I assume that, again, was also to just warm up to the U.S. By the 50s, things are starting to change. Trujillo kind of goes a little crazy. He still he's still doing the anti-communist thing. He tries to create a militia army or an army of mercenaries to overthrow Castro. But he's also doing other insane stuff. Throughout his entire administration, he's murdering political dissidents, but he's also murdering dissidents in other countries. At one point, he murders a U.S. citizen in the streets of New York City, has them gunned down in the streets of New York City. He car bombs the president of Venezuela. The U.S. has been accused of overthrowing democratically elected governments and interfering in Latin American politics. The CIA ultimately murders him or assists in his death in 1962. I don't want to ever say the CIA murdering a fort. They might have been justified in this.
Well, wait a minute. If he's responsible for an American citizen getting gunned down the streets, what was the U.S. response to that?
I assume it was
ultimately
the CIA.
Okay. Wow. That's fascinating, because this obviously predates Operation Condor.
Yes.
So this is really amazing.
Yeah.
So once he's gone, things must get better, right? No?
No.
Oh.
And I think you can... you had mentioned Lyndon Johnson's quote, because his son takes over.
That's right. That's right. And certainly, yes, and we'll clean it up because we don't know the age group here who's listening, but that's right. He might be a son of a gun, but he's our son of a gun. And that really was American foreign policy as it relates to anything that was going to fight the Red Scare, the Red Menace of communism. Hence the Operation Condor reference, where the U.S. was heavily invested in Latin American nations. I mean, Chile, for example, being among the worst for Pinochet, where these guys were given complete freedom to do anything they wanted, and disappearances and murders. But if you're doing it in the name of fighting against subversives, which was a gloriously general term for anyone that we didn't like, you could obviously affix the term communism to that. Well, then
it goes back to the old, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly.
Communism is bad. Communism is evil. These guys are fighting communism. Sure, they're murdering U.S. citizens in the streets of New York. But, hey... he's our son of a bitch.
That is really astounding, though. This guy's having U.S. citizens killed. I mean, that gives you a real sense of what his reach was. That he was not just a localized figure creating havoc on the DR or certainly involving Haiti, but actually getting into the U.S. and trying to overthrow Castro.
Yes.
Wow,
it was a lot,
and he failed with that too. Obviously, Somehow Fidel outlasted them all.
Yeah. So as we come to the end of the Trujillo story and the Sosa story, I'm left thinking about why I find this story so interesting. And my first thought when I heard this would make a great horror movie. A group of people have successfully escaped a genocide and are only aided by a man who had just committed a different genocide.
Well, it's fascinating because it has a little bit of everything. There's incredible violence, political intrigue, corruption. I mean, this is, you hate to say these guys are fascinating, but they truly, truly are. And this is a component of history that you so brilliantly are shining a light on, because I don't think much is known about Trujillo.
Well, you use the word fascinating. I've got one more anecdote for you. Do you like baseball?
I love it.
You a fan of Satchel Paige?
Of course.
He comes into the story in an interesting way. So the genocide, the Parsley Massacres were committed in 1937. It's about 1 year after the Berlin Olympics. Trujillo sees the ability sports has to raise up your prestige as a world leader. He tries to do that in the Dominican Republic. He does that by building the dream team of the Negro Leagues. Again, a white supremacist just built a baseball team. I believe they were called the Ciudad Trujillo Dragoons. So they have Trujillo written on their name, and they are made up of the best Negro League players of that era. Satchel Paige was one of them. It was why Satchel Paige would do this. Weirdly enough, the Dominican Republic, despite what they did to the Haitians, they don't have segregation in the same way we do. So there's no Negro leagues in the Dominican Republic. They're not segregated, and they're given amazing contracts. So I assume in Satchel's mind, this has to be a dream job. At first, they go to the Dominican Republic, and they notice right away some things are off. For one thing, they're being followed around by bodyguards all the time. They are also, at one point, there's a story that Satchel is thrown in jail by Trujillo, not because he had committed anything wrong, but because they wanted to keep them from screwing around in the town. And there are anecdotes from the players. I watched this documentary about this the other day. The players are just talking about Trujillo would go meet some of the players holding a loaded pistol and just reminding them, we don't lose. And so Trujillo's terrified, or not Trujillo, Satchel and the other players are terrified. What happens if we do lose?
That's a heck of a pregame pep talk.
Yeah.
Walk in, loaded gun at your players.
Yeah. The same time Trujillo is meeting with Nazi officials and being given an autographed copy of Mein Kampf, Satchel Paige is playing for one of the best baseball teams in the San Domingo.
So did they win?
They had to. For some reason, and I don't know why. Satchel didn't play a second season in San Domingo. He went to Mexico immediately. I don't know why.
Wow.
So weird. Thank you, Rich.
Oh, thank you. That was great.
Yes.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank our audience for tuning in. This has been History Repeats on hmTV. Please like and subscribe, share, and stay connected. We will be back soon with a new episode. Thank you.